Women and Christianity have been side by side since its birth. While the classical denominations, such as the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy, are heavily patriarchal, this does not mean that women had no role within them. This will be a journey into mysticism and how women with this gift could gain authority. This authority could be accepted, celebrated, or condemned, depending on how it was embodied. Some being aggressive, some being devotional, and some overstepping the accepted boundaries. From figures like St. Helena to Joan of Arc, there is no shortage of female influence within this male-dominated field. I will be separating this into sections. First, Joan of Arc is the embodiment of powerful mysticism, as she led armies with divine authority. Then, reviewing Margery Kempe and how, in contrast to Joan of Arc, Kempe embodies power through her three expressions of the female body. Finally, understanding why the same did not happen for figures like Guglielma of Milan, and how even within mysticism, there is a fine line between what gains power and authority and what becomes dangerous. First of all, what is mysticism? Well, scholars say that mysticism is first and foremost an experience. A closely related assumption is that mystical practice is the pursuit of experience. This is not very helpful as it is somewhat circular. So, how do you find these mystics if the only definition is that they have some special experience? The best way is to look at those who became highly influential or notable. In this case, I will be looking into Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a specific case as she displays a very active, powerful, and public side of mysticism that is different from others. Female mystics would typically be isolated, otherworldly, and passive. In contrast, Joan of Arc had visions that led her to become a stereotypical masculine force while still being a mystic. This shows how mysticism for Joan embodied itself as an aggressive power rather than a passive one. Joan of Arc joined the French army, claiming God had chosen her to succeed in the crowning of Charles VII. Charles VII would then give her command over an army due to her mystical experience. She would lead battles and, while not being a trained general, would see great victories under her command, enforcing strict rules for her soldiers through the authority of her divine experiences. I mention this because it shows the authority that mystics could gain from their gift. Joan of Arc and her power demonstrate an aggressive side of women and mystics that was not accepted at the time, and yet she became famous for it. Joan expressed her mystic experience through action, specifically in the command of an army, and because of this, she represents an aggressive manifestation of mysticism. Her mystic experience gained her power and gave her the strength to become someone that the society of the time was actively working against. Joan of Arc challenged gender norms and what women were believed to be capable of. She changed what people thought not just of her, but of women as a whole. She was a teenage girl and yet carried divine authority and prowess on the battlefield. Joan of Arc was a peasant girl in the 15th century France. Traditionally, she would have no power and be tied to her father until she was married. Instead, she became a saint of the Catholic Church for her divine experience and her actions. Joan of Arc, as a case study, shows the possible power that women could gain even in a patriarchal society and religion, such as the Catholic French nation of the 1400s. However, Joan of Arc is an example that most mystics did not follow. Rather, this is where we begin to see the differences between aggressive and dutiful forms of mysticism. Women played active roles within Christianity in everyday life, and their influence on theology is often underappreciated or unrecognized. The impact of these women has been long-lasting, and largely because of female mystics, as the mystical works were either written for women or composed by women. Margery Kempe, an English mystic, provides a strong case study for a dutiful mystic and an example of the materiality of the female body within mystical thought. The part that I will focus on is how traditional female mysticism treats the woman's body as a token of submission, or as something comparable to Christ's body, and how Kempe lives within and expands on this idea. Rather than rejecting this framework, Kempe turns it into a source of authority by making her bodily experiences visible signs of divine connection. Kempe specifically illustrates 3 physical means by which the female body is involved. The first is childbirth, as she had 14 children. She believed that the suffering of childbirth is a means of grace and can unite her to Christ. In this way, something typically seen as a social expectation becomes spiritually meaningful and authoritative. The second was her weeping, as she believed it to be a gift that, at the prompting of the Holy Spirit, she would burst into uncontrollable weeping. These emotional and physical displays made her spiritually public and undeniable, even when others viewed them as excessive or strange. The third is chastity. This was quite important to her, as she lived in chastity and only gave herself up within the bounds of marriage. Chastity was so important that when her son was leaving for a business trip overseas, she says to keep your body clean from women's company until you take a wife, according to the law of the church. And if you do not, I pray God chastise you and punish you for it. When he does not obey and returns covered in pustules, he comes back to her to mend his ways and seek her forgiveness, to which he is cured by her prayers. Kempe was a dutiful woman to her husband, to her children, and to God. However, her authority did not come from commanding others like Joan of Arc, but from presenting her body through suffering, emotion, and discipline as proof of her relationship with the divine. In this way, her power is quieter, but deeply influential. Around the time of Joan of Arc, there actually were many political prophets, and most of them female. The reason that Guglielma is not remembered along with Joan of Arc or Kempe is because she did not stay within the bounds of what is accepted in the church. Guglielma of Milan claimed to be the direct incarnation of the Holy Spirit, and that she would rise from the dead as Christ had. This is a very dramatic claim and was not taken seriously. I bring this up to show that while figures like Joan of Arc demonstrate how mysticism can empower women, that authority must remain within certain religious boundaries to be recognized as legitimate and long-lasting. However, this does not mean that Guglielma did not gain power during her life. She is evidence of the authority mysticism could grant women even outside the teachings of the church. She spoke of herself as being divine and established her own followers in a way that mirrored Christ and his disciples. It is incredibly important to make the distinction here. Mysticism is not always within church doctrine. Guglielma was not accepted for her beliefs, as she used mystic experience to try and extend authority that the church refused to grant. However, she did gain a cult-like following during her life. This following demonstrates the power behind mysticism itself. Even when operating outside of church doctrine, Guglielma was still able to gain influence and authority. Because this authority existed outside accepted structures, it was ultimately unstable and not preserved in the same way as figures like Joan of Arc or Kempe. In conclusion, mysticism has historically been one of the ways that women have been able to push boundaries and societal norms in order to gain power and authority. From Joan of Arc, who exercised this power in a very literal sense by leading armies into battle, to Margery Kempe, who lived a more traditional but dutiful life and made her body the site of power, rather than holding authority over others. Both demonstrate different forms of embodied authority. Guglielma represents what mystics were capable of even outside church doctrine. Her case shows that when mysticism operated without the support or approval of the church, the authority she gained could not be sustained or officially recognized in the same way. Ultimately, these examples show that women were not absent from power within Christianity, but instead found ways to access it through mysticism. Whether through action, devotion, or transgression, the female body itself became the site through which this authority was expressed.